In today's lecture, we're going to study the virus that has us all sitting at home, not able to actually go to class. The name of the virus is SARS-CoV-2, coronavirus 2. I'll explain that here very shortly, but I want to point out that what we're going to do is take a look at this virus from the scientific perspective. We're not going to be looking at how it is that the news is looking at it and how the politicians are looking at it in any way, which is where a lot of the sources of information that most people have is coming from. I want you to be able to use this lecture as a way to sort of counterbalance some of that because you should be taking the role of a professional very, very soon here, if not already. So we want to do this right. We want to understand exactly what's happening with this virus. So we're going to start by just talking about the very, very basic parts of this whole epidemic. And for example, one of the most common questions that people ask is what's the difference between SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19? SARS-CoV-2, if you look here, this is the World Health Organization website, that's the name of the actual virus itself. And the full name is Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome Coronavirus 2. And the reason it's called SARS-CoV-2 is because 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago, there was another outbreak of another SARS, which is SARS-CoV. And this virus, which I'm going to show you the evidence for this virus is extremely similar to it. So that's why it's referred to as SARS-CoV-2. The disease that it causes, the set of symptoms and the difficulties, the pathology that occurs because of the infection is called coronavirus disease from 2019, and that's shortened to COVID-19. The question that we have to address right now is where did this coronavirus come from? Where did the SARS-CoV-2 virus come from? It turns out that the coronavirus is not uncommon in the human population. There are a number of coronaviruses that cause disease, and here's a summary of them. There's these four, 1, 2, 3, 4, and they have fancy names, HCoV, NL63, 229E, and so forth. These four have been in the human population for a long time, and they cause a disease which is quite mild, and literally it's one of the disease-causing organisms that causes the common cold. The other one being respiratory syncytial virus, and the most common one is a rhinovirus. So these are not necessarily dangerous, and they've been in the human population for a long time. But there are other diseases that are caused by coronaviruses that are very severe. In fact, there's another SARS I'd mentioned earlier, this one, SARS-CoV. That was the first one, and that outbreak occurred in 2003 and 2004, again starting in China and then spreading worldwide. But it didn't really break out as bad as SARS-CoV-2 has. And then there's another one that came later in 2012, another coronavirus that hit in the Middle East primarily, and it's called MERS, M-E-R-S. And the interesting thing is that this coronavirus is actually, that epidemic is still going on, although it hasn't been quite as bad and certainly didn't make as much news as the original SARS or this one. So the question then is, how did these give rise to our current SARS-CoV-2, or did it come from somewhere else? Well, the question is also, where did these viruses come from originally? Turns out that all of these coronaviruses have very, very close relatives to coronaviruses that infect bats and rodents. And this one in particular, for example, came from bats. This one came from bats. These two came from rodents, and all the remaining ones came from bats. So our guess is initially that SARS-CoV-2 probably came from somewhere from a bat. However, it gets more complicated because the bats don't typically give the humans the disease directly. For example, this one came to humans not just through bats, but also through alpacas. And this one came from rodents through cows into humans. Now, these others we'll talk about here in a moment, but the point is that where the exact origin of this virus is unclear, but it's important to know for a couple of different reasons. First of all, we want to know its biological properties, and therefore determining its biological properties, it helps to know what's most closely related to it. And the other point is, if we can understand where it came from, then we can get a sense for whether or not this is going to happen again. Is SARS-CoV-2 going to be something we're going to have to deal with year after year now? Or is it something that this is a one-off event, one-off evolutionary event, and we don't necessarily have to worry about this exact virus attacking us again? So that's what we're going to look at now. We're going to look at specifically where these things actually arose. And this is what we know about the two severe coronaviruses so far, the SARS-CoV, which is the caused the 2003-2004 epidemic, and MERS-CoV, which caused the 2012 epidemic. These, like I said, are diseases that came from bats. Both of them, the SARS and MERS, both came from bats, and in fact the bat you're looking at here, this picture, is a bat that has a coronavirus, which is extremely similar to human beings. It's an intermediate horseshoe bat. And in the case of SARS, it came through these creatures. This is a palm civet. And what's interesting, this particular civet is something that is sold in markets in China, and that's probably how it started. The SARS originated here through this civet. And it got into the human population, but then was spread human to human. So it defines this disease as what we call a zoonotic. And there, this term is defined here for you. Zoonotic disease is any disease that gets into the human population but comes from another animal. And the same thing happened with MERS. MERS started with bats, but eventually got into these dromedary camels. Dromedary camels, of course, are very commonly used in the Middle East, and it was probably from these camels that humans got it, and then it was transferred again human to human. So given that this is what happens with coronaviruses in general, and especially the two most recent severe viruses, we're expecting SARS-CoV-2, which is similar to this genetically. I'll show you the evidence of that shortly. We expect there to be some sort of intermediate host, but the problem is, what is the intermediate host? Is it civets, is it dromedary camels, or is it something else? So this next part of the story is, to me anyway, very astonishing. And it shows how kind of luck sometimes plays a role in science. It turns out that before the SARS-CoV-2 epidemic started, somebody had discovered that these cute little creatures called pangolins have a coronavirus that's closely related, or seemingly closely related, to the original SARS-CoV that we had in 2003-2004. So another group very recently decided to take a look at this in detail, and this group here, led by Zhang, did a genetic analysis and built these evolutionary trees. Now, these evolutionary trees are things we've seen before. These show the nodes and the breakpoints leading to different lineages. For example, here's the node times going to the right. Here's the earliest common ancestor of these groups, which split into two groups, this group down here and this group up here. The group down here includes the human MERS virus that I showed you that causes severe disease in humans. And then this group up here contains the other SARS-CoV, including SARS-CoV-2. And that's this one here. This is the SARS-CoV. This is one of the isolates that was isolated from the original 2003-2004 epidemic of SARS-CoV. These magenta-colored ones are isolates that come from patients in different areas of the current SARS-CoV-2. So you can see evolutionarily they're closely related to SARS-CoV. If you follow all of these things back to this node, this is the node that connects them genetically. All the rest of these are primarily bat CoVs. They're SARS types of diseases or coronaviruses that are found in bats. This one right here, this orange one, that's the pangolin. That's the one that infects these little pangolins. And then this one, this green one, that's a bat. That's a bat coronavirus. And look how closely related these are. Now, if I were to ask you a question on the test, is this bat coronavirus more closely related to the pangolin, to the other bats, or to the human SARS-CoV-2? You should see, coming back and following back to this node, that the bat and the rest of the human SARS-CoV-2 are very closely related, more closely related than the SARS-CoV-2 or the bat is to anything else on the chart. But notice the next is the pangolin. There's the right there is the node that gives us the pangolins, and it's what they're calling the SARS-CoV-2 group. Now, this analysis here is the entire genome of the virus. This is looking at one particular gene. It's a RNA polymerase, RNA-dependent RNA polymerase, and you get a similar picture. The pangolin DNA is very similar to the bat and human SARS-CoV-2 DNA. So that's part of the story. It appears, anyway, from this analysis, that pangolins carry a coronavirus that is genetically very, very similar to SARS-CoV-2 and this particular bat SARS. Now, that indicates then that we should be looking carefully at these pangolin so that tells us we should be looking at pangolins and that disease that infects pangolins. And here is part of the analysis also done by Zhang's group that looks at one particular protein. And that protein is a critical protein in the disease infecting cells. It actually is part of a protein that binds to a receptor called ACE2. And I'm going to show you the details of that when we get into the pathology of this. But here, what we're looking at here are the original, what are called beta coronaviruses, that's the general group of coronaviruses that ours are in. All of these, except the very top one, are SARS-CoV-2. This one is SARS-CoV. There's the pangolin. There's the bat that is closely related to the human SARS-CoV-2. And then here are a bunch of others that are associated with bat SARS and so forth. Now, this one here, the original SARS, is used as a reference sequence. And you see these different letters here. Each one of these letters represents a given amino acid. Now, you've seen this before. This is the amino acid sequence. Right there is the 440th amino acid, 450, and so forth. So we're looking at only a portion of the protein. And the reason they're focusing on this portion of the protein is that this is the part of the protein that has a domain, a portion, that binds to the ACE2 receptor to get inside human cells. And they block that section out here in gray. Now, look at all of this, and you can see all these dots are saying that anything that has a dot is equal to the reference sequence. Here's the original SARS, and this then is showing that everything there has a cysteine. So all those dots, every single thing on this chart has the exact same amino acid at that spot. But notice here, in this region, there's quite a bit of variation, especially in the bat SARS. There's a lot of differences. What I want to do is to compare all of the human SARS-CoV-2s. If you look at them, they're all identical through the gray. They're all exactly identical. This one here follows back to this pangolin one. Now you notice the pangolin is also extremely similar. There's only one difference in all of this 100 or so nucleotides. There's only, or sorry, not nucleotides, amino acids. There's only one difference. Now compare that to the bat CoV, that one that evolutionarily is more closely related to the human SARS-CoV-2 than it is to the pangolin. And you notice there's a lot more variation. In this critical region, it's quite different. Now, the parts that they wanted to focus on in particular are these regions, these orange sections. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 orange sections. So the reason they're focusing on these orange sections is because these are the exact amino acid residues that bind to that ACE2 receptor. And the reason why that's important is because that's how the virus gets into the cells. So the method or the mechanism by which these SARS-CoV-2 get into cells critically depends on what amino acids are at these orange sites. Now, compare all of these human SARS-CoV-2s to the pangolin CoV. And if you look down through here at each one of those orange sections, there's a dot. Every single orange section has a dot, which means this, the pangolin and the human sequences are identical. But compare that to the bat sequence. Now remember, the bat sequence is similar, more similar to the human sequence than it is to the pangolin. And you notice that that's the same, but that one's different, that one's different, that one's different, that one's different. So 4 of the 5 key sections are different in the pangolin, different in the bat SARS than it is in the humans, whereas the pangolin and the humans are identical. So here's a summary of what Zhang and al found out. If you look just at the whole genome, all of the genes together of the various disease organisms infecting humans, that particular bat, which is SARS, which is designated RATG or RATG13, and then the pangolin coronavirus, you'll see that the human and the bat sequences are very, very similar, almost identical. They're 96% similar. And the pangolin is different. However, the pangolin is very similar to the human as well. It's about 91% similar. It's just that the bat is more so. It's 96%. But in the key region, in that region that's the binding site for the ACE1 receptor, you can see the humans and the pangolins are more closely related than they are to the bat. There's another part of the story, which I'm not going to get into in a great amount of detail, but there's one particular sequence in the human protein that catalyzes a particular reaction that neither the bat nor the pangolin has. That's something that we'll talk about maybe later, but at this point it really doesn't matter that much because all this evidence is suggesting that the SARS-CoV-2 came from bats through pangolins into humans. At least that's what appears to be what the hypothesis is suggesting based on these data. And so that's what you're finding. If you go online and you see if you ask the question, where did this disease come from? Here, this picture comes from a U.S. government site, an NIH site, and it shows again bats to pangolins, then to humans, and then now it's of course being transmitted human to human. So there's other evidence here that's important, and this is not evidence I'm going to show you the details of because we just don't have time to go through all of it, but I just want to mention it. First of all, a group that was led by Anderson studied the details of the DNA sequence of the SARS-CoV-2 and compared it to lab strains of SARS-CoV-2 and came to the conclusion that the current strain of SARS-CoV-2 that's infecting human beings is almost certainly not from a lab. So it isn't either an intentional, there's no evidence anyway that it's an intentionally released virus, and there's no evidence that it was a mistake that somebody in the lab sort of left open and let it out. So there's good evidence that it's not a human-caused sort of virus. And the other couple things that support that, first of all, almost all or most of the cases that were originally discovered, going all the way back to the earliest cases, the earliest COVID-19 cases that were treated, were all in China, and most of them were associated with this open seafood market in Huanan, in Wuhan, China. And so that tends to indicate that that market is probably the source. That's probably where it started. And the other thing that's interesting is that the genetic analysis, if you look at the how it is that the variations that we see in SARS-CoV-2 compared to the most common, most recent ancestor of it in the bat, it looks very much like that virus hit the human population sometime in November or early December 2019. And that fits with the earliest cases. The very earliest cases in China were also found at that time. So all this evidence is pointing to the conclusion that the SARS-CoV-2 originated probably in this market in China, and they were selling pangolins for meat, and the people who bought those pangolins unwittingly ingested the virus and became infected, and then the virus either evolved immediately there or was already pre-adapted to go human to human after that point.